introduce you, Raymond. You're an amazing curator of an amazing architecture department, and you have to tell us a little bit more about yourself, because I think you do it better than me before we start getting into, deeper matters, because you're Irish, right?
I am.
I have a big crush on Irish guys, but anyhow.
All right.
Tell us about what you do right now, and how did you become a curator for architecture?
So that's a good way to start off. As you know, Ruth, there aren't that many departments of architecture in art museums in the States. We exist here in the Carnegie Museum of Art, which is a museum with a very long history, founded, of course, by Andrew Carnegie. It's now one of the 4 Carnegie museums in Pittsburgh. There's, as well as art, there's natural history, science, and the baby, if you like, is the Andy Warhol Museum, which is fantastic. And of course, he was born in Pittsburgh.
Amazing.
I used to say my patron saint. So in any event, a very important figure, of course, in international art. And within the art museum, there are 5 or 6 departments, and one of them is the architecture department. And we exist since the early 90s through the foresight and generosity of Mrs. HEINZ, Drew HEINZ. You might remember in the 70s and 80s, she and her husband used to fund the HEINZ galleries in London on Portman Square. It was part of the RIBA, or connected to the RIBA. And then in the 90s, they amalgamated with the V&A. So if you go to the V&A now, there was wonderful architecture spaces upstairs. That is the current manifestation of the V&A architectural collection. I use the word collection because I know you want to talk about exhibitions, but of course, as we're a museum, the collection is also a very important part of what we do. And one could argue that that's in terms of a longer historical horizon, that isn't a strange use of English, that might even be more important than, in some ways, than exhibitions, which of course typically last only for a couple of months. We have about 6,000 objects in our collection. We can have a nice talk about collections and how collections occur and what they should be. That's a very important subject in and of itself. We have about 400 square meters of exhibition space. It's designed in 1990 in a rather, I would say, specific style, perhaps at the tail end of postmodernism. So I think it's really designed for an idea that architecture exhibitions consist of framed works on paper and perhaps some models on pedestals. A very traditional idea.
For our viewers, who designed this? Who designed it?
It's a practice from New York called Cicognon. I always get the vowels wrong. He's Italian. Cicognon Cala, I think. Anne Cala was an architect. Unfortunately, she passed away years ago. An architect who was trained here in Pittsburgh, in fact, and they do very elegant, let's say, residential work mostly, I think, in the New York area. It has a series of rooms, and without getting too much into the weeds, there are 3 doors in, and this gives us interesting problems because sometimes an exhibition wants to have a linear trajectory or an unfolding. So that doesn't work well for our spaces. But other exhibitions, and to my mind, some of my favorite exhibitions are more mixed so that the visitor can, as it were, pop in at any moment. And that brings up an interesting issue for us, that because we're within the art museum and the Natural History Museum is immediately next to us with its famous dinosaurs, for example, that people who come to our exhibitions are sometimes people with a very specific mission. They want to come and see an architecture exhibition, but other times people are coming to look for Monets or indeed for dinosaur bones, and they end up in an architecture exhibition. So So, and sometimes that might be the most wonderful thing that can happen, right?
I love it. It's cross-education, as Bernard would say, I guess.
You know, we have some wonderful, we have 42nd Street by Bernard in the collection from Manhattan Transcripts, which is a very important piece for us to have.
No,
And there are 3 copies. He has one, MoMA has one, and we have one.
great, great. So back to my question. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit about what you're doing at your museum right now. But how did you end up being a curator?
Well,
architecture.
Well, as you know, I'm an architect by training, and so trained in Dublin, and then at Yale, and then I moved to, as you know, to LA. That's how we have many friends in common. Rick, of course, we worked together in Los Angeles, and I used to joke that our apartment should be called Hotel Deutschland, because there were so many German architecture students showing up at different stages in Santa Monica. So when I went to LA, it's a very strange thing. And in fact, I asked this person recently about this, and she didn't have the same memory. But when I went to LA, I, of course, wanted to meet as many architects as possible, if only to go and interview for a job. But I always tell my students, when I was teaching, I taught for 10 years in Dublin, and I always advise the students that when they go to a new city, whether it's Berlin or Sydney, wherever it might be, that they should try and go and see as many architectural offices as possible, even if the architect doesn't have a job for you. Go and see what the atmosphere is like in the office. You can very quickly get a sense of, is it somewhere you want to work? So I was in London in the early 80s. I was in New Haven for 2 spells, and in the middle I was in London. And besides hanging out at the AA bar for a very long number of evenings, I remember, for example, going to for an interview with Dennis Lasdon. And then when I went to LA, I went for an interview. Both of these interviews, I should say, weren't real interviews, because they both more or less said they didn't have work. But when I went to LA, I went to see John Lautner. And so both of those, I remember, it's funny, Lasdon and Lautner, it's almost like a firm or something right there, the 2 L's. But both of those so-called interviews were really conversations, I think. And both of those architects were generous enough to show me what they had done and what they were working on. So with this idea in mind that sometimes, let's say interviews or conversations can lead to other things. When I got to LA, somebody asked me to write something for a magazine about English architecture. And because I'm from Ireland, but they thought I was English, and that's fine, that's okay. I was very happy to write about something about London. And that then led, in a funny way, to very, very quickly writing for Blueprint. So we did an issue of, for example, on LA with Rowan Moore in 1990, the LA issue. So this got me into the idea of writing. So then I moved back to Dublin and began teaching at the university. So the writing expanded, let's say, and that then began to include writing for some catalogues for exhibitions. Mm-hmm. So when it came to the late 90s, Ireland doesn't have a pavilion in Venice, a formal pavilion, unlike, of course, the UK, France, Germany, etc., in the Giardini. And oddly, Ireland had sent some very good artists to Venice in the 50s, but then stopped for 35 years. I don't know why.
So which pavilion were they in, the Irish? Did they take
back in the 50s, I don't know what they did in the 50s. I simply don't know. Michael Scott, who's our most important our architect in Ireland, he was quite a character. He was very involved in the visual arts, very involved in theatre. He claims in his they're not really memoirs, but it's a published conversation, that he says he has he proposed an Irish pavilion as a bridge across the canal. That's to say, the canal, if you like, going from where the Israeli pavilion is across to where the Brazilian pavilion is. There's that small canal. He claims he proposed that, but I don't know if if it really was a real project. It might have been a nice idea dreamt up over a good dinner in Venice, right? But the point is that for 35 years, we didn't send anybody to the Art Biennale. And as we all know, the Architecture Biennale had a rather slow start, and but the Teatro del Mondo by Aldo Rossi. Aldo Rossi, as far as I know, never came to Ireland, but was a very important figure for my generation and the architects who are a little older than I am. The Teatro del Mondo was a star project for the 79 Biennale, in fact. And then in 1980, of course, we were all, and many of us, were enthralled by the images of the Strada Nuovissima by Portuguese's Biennale, which was the first architecture Biennale. So then in the 90s, I thought, okay, as the Biennale, the Architecture Biennale is becoming more and more organized and institutionalized, let's say, let's try and make an Irish pavilion. So I think this is only something you might do as a kind of young person and maybe a little bit naively, but we got some money from the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so I asked Tom Dupuer, who's a brilliant architect, now teaching at Harvard, to literally make a pavilion, which is a completely crazy thing, right? That the word pavilion is used in the Biennale. Even if you hire a room somewhere in Venice, that's categorized as a pavilion. It's a slightly misleading, it's a kind of misleading word. So we thought in our naivety, we should go and make a pavilion. So that was the first project. And Tom had this fantastic idea to fill a truck full of peat briquettes. And peat briquettes, that's turf, essentially. Right. The Germans, RUTH, came to Ireland during the Weimar Republic and began...
Is it the stuff that you guys burn? No.
You burn, exactly.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. It's during the Weimar Republic, after we got independence in 1921. And so the government asked some German companies to come and mass produce, dry, and package turf as small bricks known as briquettes. And every Irish convenience store, probably even still, certainly 20 years ago, had these, and people would buy them even if they don't use the fireplace at home very much. It's a kind of nostalgic thing.
I love it.
And so Tom had this extraordinary idea to fill a truck full of turf, bring it to Mestre, then somehow we got it from Mestre over to Venice, and he made a small cubic building, which was then, in Tom's words, donated as a gift from the land-rich people of Ireland to the land-poor people of Venice. So the first pavilion was an actual pavilion. Then 2 years later, we were able to get a space in the central pavilion in the Giardini, and we did a different project with the architects Merit Buchholz and Karen McAvoy. And that year I was involved in different ways with the Biennale. So the Biennale was my way into making exhibitions. Mm-hmm. And then around 2002 or 2003, the job became available here, the role of curator. And Richard Armstrong, the director at the time, now the director of the Guggenheim, came to Dublin and, let's say, convinced me to apply for the job.
Amazing. Like, I have so many more questions for you. Okay. I think when I met you first, it might have been in New York, it might have been at the Biennale. I wouldn't even know anymore. But we have so many, not just acquaintances in common, but also friends. And for me to know somebody who is going into architecture curatorship was just really fascinating. And clearly, through our friends, we stayed in contact. So this time, Germany, everybody believes it's over and is hoping a second wave is not going to come. But in your museum, how do you deal? First of all, is there any hope you're going to open soon? And secondly, if you do open soon, how are you changing around formats? We come to much other questions again, but that's just a quick question in between, that all the curators in the world are thinking about right now, I think.
Well, if I begin with some of the pragmatic issues, we will begin opening our doors on Monday week, but that will be in a very limited way. We have had, the drawings are still there in the dark, a beautiful show, 100 drawings by Lino Bobardi, curated by Zoila Lima. It was a similar version, not exactly the same, was at the Miro Foundation in Barcelona last year. So the drawings are all there, but in the dark. So they have to go back to Brazil. So that's a very pragmatic thing we have to deal with.
You cannot extend the exhibition.
Almost certainly not.
Wow.
It was coming to the end of it only had 2 more weeks to go when we closed our doors. And we have to liaise with the nice people at the Instituto Bobardi in Sao Paulo. They have to come, somebody from there has to come, and then the drawings go back. It's quite a complicated thing. So we have to deal with that. That's a pragmatic thing.
Yeah.
Then I've been working on a show for a little while called The Fabricated Landscape. It's a show of work by 10, let's say, younger practices. The architects are all born in and around 77, 78. And that was supposed to go up next, but we now have to move that exhibition into next year, we think. So it has to go on 1 slot. And in the interim, we will show works in the collection, which isn't a bad idea. We have a collection, as I mentioned before, and it's always useful for us to show works from the collection, because sometimes people say, yes, we'd love you to have a drawing, but what happens to it? So it's good for us to have an opportunity.
And I frankly didn't know what an amazing collection you guys have. I really had no idea, and you mentioned it right at the beginning, and I think it's really worth showing. As a curator, what would be, and I'm asking all these questions because I get you all in the living room or in your studies, and I'm, I've never interviewed people before, but I'm not trying to get anything personal out of anybody, but I think what's so interesting about these times, I can ask different questions that I would usually ask. So if you could dream up what you're going to do in the next 30 years, what would be your number one goal?
Okay, so that's a big jump from but my answer to the first question was the very pragmatic things that we're doing just at the moment. If we stay close to that issue, Ruth, just for a moment, about what we can do in the short term, obviously we're all working much more like this. So a lot more of what we're doing as curators and architects and writers is online, that's for sure. Also the museums and the galleries. If you look at the art galleries, the rather fancy ones in particular, because of course they have resources, they're doing so much more online in terms of interviews, short films, all those kinds of things. So we as a museum are very conscious of that. So we're trying to move in that direction, but of course it's not something that a large institution can do too quickly. So as part of that idea of going more online, and I've started class is too formal a word, but there's a series of presentations. I do it now every Wednesday afternoon, called Walking Pittsburgh, because since the lockdown, I've tried to get out for a good walk every day, and so I've been documenting what I see, and that's become a small set of presentations. So that's just a small example of something we can do online. Now, if you move out a little in terms of this discussion, move out a little bit beyond the immediate term, I think we have to think very seriously about what more we can do online, what the connection is. I mean, I've long said, my colleagues are sick to death of hearing me say this, that the website is our front door in terms of the museum, that's the place where people go to get a sense of what's happening at the museum. They may be excited and intrigued by something they find. They may conversely be turned off by something they find. So we have to think very seriously at the moment about our front doors. We have many, many of them because Carnegie funded this enormous museum, and we have many, many ways in, I mean, literally physically ways into the museum. And so we may have to limit that in terms of controlling numbers. This is a very practical, pragmatic issue. And so we've been thinking about what does somebody who is physically visiting the museum, what is the first thing they see when they walk into the foyer? I thought, did you read Florian Edenberg's essay this week about foyers and museums?
I didn't, but I will now, right after this interview.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it's very interesting. And I should add, they're in our exhibition, The Fabricated Landscape. And so we're very conscious of that physical portal, let's say. But in advance of that, the website is the portal. So we have to think, I mean, we've been talking about this for years in a rather abstract way. But now I think we have to get serious about what exactly is on the museum's website. So as we look further out, you asked 30 years. Of course, we don't know where we'll all be in 30 years. Maybe Ruth, we'll all be sipping nice drinks around a pool in Palm Springs or something.
Hopefully we have one of these, how do you call it? We call them Alterswege. Hopefully we have one of these amazing co-housing
exactly.
houses where the weather is nice, we can still afford nice food and booze, and we can, exchange ideas and not turn into numbers. That would be so amazing to keep.
Wouldn't that be fun? We could swap books and exchange movie tips. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend I cook for other people, but
no,
cooking.
I cook and we write books together. I love cooking, but I think that the future is clearly involving different generations. I do believe that, and that would have been a topic of the Biennale that we're now gonna have in coming May. And I think that all the generations have to work together, because it doesn't help if a very young person has a startup and somebody else can cook and somebody else can knit and somebody else can teach and somebody else can write. I think we all need to cooperate and see where we take this world. But that might be just my ideal planet for the future.
So you asked about 30 years out. I would say that I'm not sure we can possibly imagine what 30 years out is like.
5 years, 1 year.
Yeah, but let's say 5 years, and so we have to be as museum people, and also I would argue as architects, certainly thinking architects, right? We have to be much more facile and clever and strategic about communicating with each other, but also with the public in general. The public in general includes, of course, clients, right? So I think there's a for somebody of my generation, there's a whole upskilling that has to happen right now, because I'm a little older than you are, so I'm still of the generation, that drew pencil drawings and made cardboard models with lots of, Elmer's glue. So there is, that's a very interesting, that's a very interesting issue, I think. I completely agree with you about generations working together. One important thing about exhibitions like the Biennale in particular, and exhibitions more generally, but when I say the Biennale, I'm thinking not just of Venice, I'm thinking of Shenzhen, I'm thinking of Chicago, of Sharjah, of these other places, which is a different type of exhibition by and large, is that it's often the place where young architects are challenged to present their ideas to a broader audience. And that's an amazing opportunity for young architects. So I think that has to be encouraged and promoted. Whether we call them biennales or not isn't the point. The point is that people invest their time and energy and, dare I say, their love into doing something.
Yeah, so much work.
That is not, of course, there's always an aspect of egotism in it, there has to be, but isn't essentially egotistical. It's more about sharing ideas with the broader world about what the built environment can be in the near and far future. So if we think of what Portuguese did by taking over the Corderia and the Arsenale in Venice, that sort of space is a very interesting space to work in. What they've been doing in Shenzhen at different biennials, reusing more or less, I think, abandoned industrial spaces is also interesting, because it may give the architects in question more flexibility than a very formal museum context, where things are very processed, you know.
The reason why I wanted to have you is because you have the overview. You work in the States. You're clearly from Ireland. You know, there's the U.K. now separated, maybe not, who knows. But you have been across the planets, and I think that's so fascinating. And do you think, when I listen to you, I think it's just a global thing that's happening. But are there differences in exhibiting architecture or promoting architecture, or are there differences or not? But is there a big difference in terms of architectural communication or curatorship around the globe? Like, is Europe different from the States? Is the States different from, you know, let's just say we go to Sao Paulo Biennale, whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, you have so much experience. Tell us about it.
Well, I think here, if I go back to this complex and doubly complex world that we're in at the moment in the States, where there's the COVID situation, and then we have these issues of racial equity and policing and politics. It seems to me that inherent in what we're talking about are issues of people's access to money and to facilities of different sorts. So I think you and I are lucky enough to exist in a world where we have colleagues and friends in different places around the world. So we can talk to each other like this, or we meet at different situations, or we share books and all this kind of thing. We go on reviews. But I think in terms of the global projection, I mean, the reality is that if you're an ambitious young architect in South America, for example, you may try very hard to get to Columbia to do graduate studies, for instance. Or if you're a similar person from, let's say, Thailand, you may want to go to Germany for studies. So I think we have to acknowledge that there is this group of architects and curators and artists, indeed, and designers and academics who know each other through this world that's both virtual and real in terms of getting on planes, albeit back in steerage at the cheapest possible seat, to get to an exhibition or to visit colleagues. So there is this economic imbalance. So it could very well be that somebody in America who hasn't been able, for financial reasons or family reasons, to get to a well-known school may have a lot more in common with a similar person in, let's say, Ecuador or in Burma. I'm just picking places here at random. So I think we have to acknowledge that we exist in an elite of some sort, even if we know that that elite is not necessarily super rich, but we can share our experiences and ideas. And so I think as we move forward, there has to be some way, you asked about the global perspective, there has to be some way of bringing in more voices. And that's not just about from around the world, it also means from within our own states, whether it's Germany or the United States or the UK or China, of course.
I think you made the best point ever, because if we wouldn't have been able to travel the countries, work and study in different places, like both being European and we have an amazing network, but we established that in times when we could fly, even if we were on the last seat.
Yes. Yeah. I can assure you,
we came anyway.
Yeah.
And we weren't that we were conscientious about the surrounding, but we weren't shamefaced about taking a plane at that point either yet, 30 years ago. Let's just say that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think your point is so important. Let's just say in 1 or 2 years from now, or even a few months from now, hopefully everything's going to be fine and everybody will go back to having their studies abroad and do all of that. In case we can't do that, we still need to find a way to establish a network. We have that network. We're old enough to have an amazing network, and that's not going to go away. But for somebody who's 20 now, they in order to be in the position that we are in right now, to talk to people across the continent, they need to go out there. It's not going to happen via Zoom.
Yeah. Zoom can help, but it's not enough. And of course, I could perhaps turn this question back to you, Ruth, and as a professor, and obviously many of these issues are also in the university about how are young architects to be trained in now and in the near future. I think for us, and made that little joke about hanging out of the AA bar, but there's some seriousness in that as well, because you observe people and you see how people behave to each other, and that's all part of becoming a professional person, I think. So if the AA bar and other venues aren't as present as they were in our education, we have to find, or and of course the younger generation has to find, other ways of getting to know each other, to challenge each other, to support each other.
Exactly, and I mean that's why we started this rolling bar, and I think we had amazing talks already. You're going to be you talk number 7, which is my lucky number, and that was one trial to get students together and get interesting people to talk to them, or talk about issues. And I have no idea. I mean, I do get a lot of feedback, but I think nobody believes in the fact that this might last longer. So it's always a temporary thing. It's for one term, and so it's totally okay. And we have tons of visitors. We have so many visitors. It's amazing from all over the world. People really enjoy this, but how is it gonna transfer into the real rolling bar that we have at our university? We don't know.
But Ruth, what you say, of course, is very important and applies to COVID. But I want to emphasize again that here, at least at this moment in the States, there is a sense of political turmoil, perhaps, but certainly also possibilities. And I think from somebody here in Pittsburgh, I think we have to be very conscious of that. And I don't have, of course, nobody should have a solution. That's not the point. The point is the opposite way around. People in roles like ours, this is not the moment to be giving solutions. It's the other way around. We have to, I think everybody, nearly all of my colleagues feel this is the time to listen and to see how we move forward with greater equity, as they say, in society. And as you know, this is a major issue in universities as well, the issue of equity. Are the students in universities existing in a little bubble, or do they communicate, liaise with, interact with the broader world? This is a very interesting issue, I think. There's no simple solution.
No, there's no simple solution, but you know, also bringing up the political and situation and the latest events all over the world, it's totally insane. I mean, it's such an insane time where so many things happen at the same time, or even are induced by the first thing happening. I have the feeling that a lot of people are so aggressive that they would rather go on the street and get sick than not protest, and whether that comes from the anger for, you know, the issue at hand, or whether it comes from the anger from being locked up for 4 months, we don't know that either in some cases. And it's, you know, we're not doing politics here right now, but I wonder, and I think that in all the countries I have contact to, people are divided. They're divided, and I don't even know how you can be divided in difficult times like that. But it's happening. So, well, do we come to the conclusion that clearly, us being architects, we cannot come up with a solution? We can only try and help with the communication, I think.
Well, I feel very strongly that architects can and should offer suggestions and structures to help us all move forward. And that might sound naive in some ways, but for example, you asked about what we're thinking about in the near future at the museum. So we started a program a couple of years ago. HEINZ Architectural Center is sometimes known as HAC, so we call it HAC Lab. And the idea is that to get us off the treadmill of the, if you like, characteristic or typical museum exhibition, which very quickly is reduced to a checklist. And I keep saying to my dear and wonderful colleagues that a checklist is not an exhibition, because a checklist is a list of all the drawings and photographs and models in an exhibition. But unlike an art exhibition, where the paintings and sculptures and photographs, let's say, are the exhibition, in architecture, these things are only suggestive of the architecture, because it's very, very, very rare that you can get to an exhibition where there's a piece of architecture there, or it's even considered, I would say, in an architectural way. There are, of course, exceptions. One of my favorite exhibitions ever was Blueprints for Modern Living at MoCA back in 1989, looking at the case study house program. And
Amazing.
A seminal exhibition.
Amazing.
Did you get to see it? Were you in LA?
I just saw the catalog because I entered it's in 1992, so it was before my time, but already I was, you know, determined to to conquer the architecture world, and so yeah.
Conquer is a nice word. Yeah, it's a nice catalog. Lorraine Wild, by the way, is the graphic designer, a very fine graphic designer.
Amazing. I watched a talk with Hans-Uri Obrist the other day, and he's clearly he's in charge of the Serpentine. He's thinking about new formats, but and I think one thing is new formats and becoming more digitalized and involving more formats. But the other thing is, with a lot of the exhibitions that happened, you guys as architecture curators, you also frame a time period, and it could be 5 years or 10 years or 20 years or 15 years or 1 year. And you can give it a name, and you just come out with an exhibition and you put a name to it. And that, Philip Johnson did it, right? Some people did it, and so that's my vision for you, my darling.
Well, that's very kind. I'm not sure about the use of the word "just" in that statement. When you say "just come up with a title or a vision,"
but to say, you know. We had the refugee crisis. All of a sudden, you know, modules became an issue, right? then now we're having the COVID-19 crisis, and it's yet to be seen what architects and architectural theorists are coming up right now. You know, we're in the midst of it. But and I'm not saying you should do an exhibition about that time, but I'm just saying something is going to happen, something major is going to happen, and there is going to be a big shift, whether it's the way we exhibit, whether it's the way we do architecture, whether it's the way we do think architecture. I had an interview with a colleague of mine last week about Archicram, and a lot of the fashion designers in the 70s all of a sudden had bubble heads and big visors, and the underwear, they had like these onesies, white onesies, and then like neon-colored little things, you know, and yeah. It was all about, but I think that was when the first rocket went up to the moon, and all of a sudden, because I said, was it a war? It wasn't a war. Why were there all of a sudden, why did they need their private space? And we found out it was all about going to space, and you know, so let's just see what this time will do to us and how it will influence us. And thank you so much for talking to me. I could talk to you forever, but I think already we did an hour, and I hope that our viewers.
Ruth, you've given me a nice idea there. I think, and listening to myself talk, it occurs to me that the structure of an exhibition could be thought of in the same way that architects and planners are trying to think about how to address these big social issues that you refer to, whether it's people coming from Africa across the Mediterranean, whether it's people at the US-Mexican border, just to mention two examples. If there's a way to think about an exhibition, not like the dreaded checklist, but as a kind of simulacrum isn't quite the right word, but as a prototype for how to address these very complex physical planning issues in the real world. That would be a very interesting way to think about an exhibition in and of itself.
But I hope you don't have nightmares, darling.
Ruth, it's great to see you.
So please, thank you so much. Raymond, Brian, hello to Pittsburgh. Stay online, please. We say goodbye to our viewers now, but we're going to have a little talk, what we're going to show with your interview. Thank you.
Ruth.
Bye. Ciao, ciao.